Good morning, everyone. My name is Kim Olver, and I'm the Executive Director of William Glasser International and William Glasser Institute US. And today, to my great pleasure, I have author of Beyond Prozac, Dr. Terry Lynch. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Lynch.
Thank you very much, Kim. I'm very pleased and honored to be part of this summit today. Very happy to be here.
It's just such a joy to have you here. I know that you have spoken at one of our conferences, and also in Ireland at the William Glasser Institute in Ireland. So I know that you know many of our members and have a particular relationship with our former board president, Brian Lennon.
Yes. I've had a very nice relationship with the William Glasser Institute really for the past 10 years. It's something I'm very happy about. I've spoken at least twice, I think, at the Irish annual conferences, and you're right, I have lots of connections and friends really involved in the whole reality therapy William Glasser Institute. And the Institute is a group that I feel very positive about. I really like what you do, and I like how the organization, so I'm very happy to be part of this today. And of course, William Glasser himself was quite an influence on me. What a lovely, gorgeous man.
Yes.
I think I said to you, my connection with the Institute started really when Brian Lennon sent Bill a copy of Beyond Prozac, and he loved it. And then we ended up having a relationship, really, and it's very special. It's one of the seminal moments for me of the last 20 years, or 12 years since Beyond Prozac was published.
Excellent. I know great minds think alike, and I know you and Bill thought a lot along the same lines as it relates to mental health. And really, this summit was designed, first of all, to bring tribute and honor to Dr. Glasser and his ideas, but also to focus on mental health as more than just the absence of mental illness. And I think that your message really aligns with ours, and we'll talk about that as we move forward. But I'm wondering, how would you define mental health?
Right. I think I'd answer that in this way. I believe that when we, in society, the prevailing interpretation of mental health as mental illness, we get off on the wrong foot at the very start. When somebody comes to me, there are certain characteristics that are virtually always present. So I kind of answer your question in a slightly roundabout way. What are the characteristics that are regularly present in someone who is in distress? And they are what I would call woundedness, shock, distress, a whole series of defense mechanisms, and unfinished emotional business. So that's how I try to frame what people come to me about. In terms of mental health and happiness, I often think that happiness can perhaps be described as, or the degree of happiness an individual has is often and usually proportional to the degree to which their needs are met. That's a recurring theme that I see. So somebody whose needs are met to a very low degree cannot really be happy. And there's so many characteristics, I suppose, of mental health. One big one would be, self-efficacy, the ability to actually shape one's life as one feels one needs to. And I think that, unfortunately, the mental health services that prevail around the world have missed that point completely.
Right. That's really our thought about that as well. And so when you think about, I know one of the quotes that we used of yours was something about people who are labeled mentally ill or actually just having a human experience. Could you say more about that?
Yeah, and that's related to what I said at the beginning. When somebody walks into me, and a lot of the people who come to me have had a diagnosis made already of depression, bipolar, schizophrenia. I would say 70% of the people who come to me already have a diagnosis. And I can, within one or two sessions, the story makes sense to me as an unfolding human story.
Right.
And that's really how I try to go about it. I think the idea of labeling is a distraction. It's a distraction from what is actually going on. And the same applies to the whole, in my opinion, to the whole thing of suicide. I mean, I can understand how a person becomes suicidal in this world that we live in. So I try to make sense of the experience, and I rarely meet a person whose experiences I cannot make sense of. So whether it's hearing voices, whether it's mania, whether it's depression, or, I often think that when we talk about, say, depression as the problem, depression often isn't actually the core problem. There are slightly deeper issues that are going on, of which depression is just one. So to me, accuracy is very, very important, to try to actually be very accurate about what is actually fundamentally going on. And then to work from that point.
I know one of my pet peeves, I do some work with our military here, and I really, if anyone listening has any influence on the people who wrote the DSM, I really hate the label post-traumatic stress disorder. I wish we could just call it post-traumatic stress. It's such a normal response to an unusual situation. So I'm completely with you there.
That is absolutely right. Just one thing about I was just thinking before we went on air. This thought struck me a few months ago. To actually, even to reach that definition of post-traumatic stress disorder, something very, very, very serious has to have happened to you, either some form of an attack or a loss of someone very close to you. So, and yet you can be diagnosed as having depression in 3 minutes in a doctor's surgery. So we've cultivated in society a framing of experience that whereby depression as a defining term has become far more accepted than trauma. And I think that that's no coincidence. One of the issues that I focus on quite a lot is who frames mental health in the world, and do they have a vested interest? And is there a distortion going on of human experience? A distortion. I'm currently writing a book. The title will probably be Depression Delusion. And there will be 3 volumes to that. And the first is looking at what I call the myth of the chemical imbalance, because it is a myth. There was never any evidence of a chemical imbalance. But that's just one example of what I'm saying about how very powerful groups have framed how society interprets distress. And what you said about post-traumatic stress disorder is one example. I mean, we human beings are fragile. It's a tough world we live in. Trauma is common. Woundedness is common. And yet we deny it. We deny its existence. And I think we have to get real as a society about what's really going on in terms of what people are experiencing. As I said, I work with a lot of people with diagnosis of depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, eating disorders, people who are suicidal. And if there are many common themes I see, and one of them is woundedness. It's a common recurring theme. And I think we have to start addressing what is actually there, rather than an interpretation of what is there. That's a distortion of reality, in my opinion.
Well, and that really segues nicely into the next question I wanted to ask you, were the biggest personal and cultural obstacles to happiness. And what you just talked about may be a cultural obstacle. I don't know if you want to say more about cultural obstacles, and then maybe some personal obstacles to happiness.
Yeah. Well, I think we live in a society, and I think the same is true in America. We live in societies where, on the surface, people have freedom, and on the surface, people are told, you can be anything you want, and yet beneath the surface, and not far beneath the surface, from a young age, children learn that there are certain things you cannot do, and there are certain things you cannot be. Boys learn at a young age it's not okay to cry, for example. And I feel that we are in our westernized societies, we are shaping people into a certain mold, and in that mold, pain, for example, distress, sadness, loss, tears, the so-called negative feelings are they're sort of censored out of existence. They're declared to be not okay. And I think that's a major cultural block to happiness, because in my experience, and in my own personal experience, but also in my work, I feel it's very important for us human beings to have access to the range of emotions. I often call them, in Selfhood, my book that I published 2 years ago, I refer to it as the rainbow of emotions. You know, blue is not better than red. It's just different. And I don't think sadness is worse than joy. It's just different. They're both very valid emotions that we need to go through as human beings. But if we're blocking our experience and our discussions, you know, that's another very important thing. I mean, conversations now about mental health often revolve around depression. Now, depression is an interpretation of experience. We need to get back to the raw experience. We need to be talking about sadness, loss, pain. And I think the more we can validate and acknowledge the rightness of those emotions, then I think it becomes easier to come into joy. I don't think we can have a joyful life if we're blocking one half of what we human beings experience. I think we're hampered and compromised.
I agree with that. I once was at a friend's funeral, and his mother had been given, excuse me, his mother had been given antidepressants, and at his funeral, she was acting very unlike I'd ever seen her act. She wasn't sad.
Yeah.
Excuse me, although I know she was sad, but the sadness was medicated away, and she was really robbed of the experience, I believe, of truly mourning and saying goodbye to her son in an appropriate way.
Yes, that's right. I mean, we have a cultural fear of what I call it, the intensity of our feelings. And I think many prescriptions are actually written. I'm not talking specifically about the doctor's retina now, by the way, but I think that much of our acceptance of medication for emotional and mental distress is because society is uncomfortable with it. We still talk as a society about people at a funeral who were strong and who didn't cry and who didn't show emotion, and then maybe another person who was very emotional, and people will often say, oh, they were very bad, they were very upset. But that person is more likely to work through their loss and grief than the person who is stuck. Because, and this is a recurring theme in my work, that the process of recovery means moving through, generally speaking, not avoiding or trying to get around something, but actually moving through the pain, and then one can come to peace.
Right. There's a purpose for the pain.
Absolutely, absolutely. In my opinion, every human emotion has a purpose, and I think we'd be far better off as a society to look at what the purposes might be than to decide that certain challenging emotions and feelings have no purpose, and therefore all we should do is try to obliterate them. We should have learned really from history that when we try to obliterate something, it finds another way to come back and bite us.
It surely does. It's like the finger in the dam. It's going to come out somewhere else, and it's going to make it even worse.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you believe that there's things that people can do to improve their mental health? Kind of, daily habits people can develop that will move them from on the spectrum from wherever they are to a little bit happier.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are many. And feel free to prompt me on this now. Again, in my work, for example, the whole thing of defense mechanisms, for example, they play a huge part in our life in general, and they play a huge part in the life of when we get distressed. We often try to defend and protect that. I have found generally action to be a very important action. Quite often when people are distressed, they've pulled back and they have withdrawn from action. And when I hear a person's story, I'll try to work with them to see what actions they might be able to take to move things forward just a little bit. And so action would be one, but it needs to be realistic action. Because if it's 4 or 5 steps beyond what that person's able for, then the person isn't going to be able to do it, and they're going to feel worse for that. It's going to be another reason to blame themselves for failing. Action, I try to cultivate gentleness, that the person would be gentle with themselves, self-care, self-expression. I often suggest to people that they start journaling, what I call self-honoring. You know, as I said, 2.5 years ago, I wrote a book called Selfhood. And the reason I wrote that was because I thought that there were a lot of aspects to the self. We talk about self-esteem, for example, as being a very important characteristic. And it is important, but it's only one aspect of selfhood. So I would regularly encourage people to look at what they can do to increase their sense of self, to try to rely on themselves a little bit more, to try to do something nice for themselves that maybe doesn't take too long, to speak their mind a little bit more, perhaps, to look at their needs, and to, you know, some people come to me, and I'm sure you'll be familiar with this, Kim. They have no concept of what their needs are. So for them, one of the first steps is to actually take some time to identify what their needs might be. And for them, that's movement, you know. So to me, it's about where is the person at and what can we do to edge things forward.
Almost like a Kaizen approach, baby steps, small steps.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, small steps taken frequently. Yes.
Great, great. Tell us a little bit about your work and how it relates to mental health and happiness. We've mentioned, you know, 2 of your books and a 3rd coming out. What do you do, and what led you to this field, and what is your particular focus in terms of mental health and happiness?
Right. Well, what led me to it was I qualified as a medical doctor in the mid-1980s. I worked as a family physician. We call them GPs here. I think you call them family physicians in America, for about 10 years. And I suppose I was going through a process myself of change and inquiry. And when I qualified, I was a very enthusiastic doctor. But 10 years on, I had lost faith in a lot of what I have been trained in, particularly in mental health. I began to realize that the stories people came in with didn't match what I had been trained in. It just didn't match it at all. Right. The whole DSM system of diagnosis, it did not fit the people. So I went away and I trained in psychotherapy, and for the past, I did an MA, Masters in Psychotherapy. So for the past 12 years, I've provided what I call a recovery-oriented mental health service, because I feel there's an enormous need for an alternative way of looking at, a better way, a more accurate way of looking at and understanding what we call mental illness and mental health problems. So my daily work consists of meeting with between 3 and 6 people a day for 50, 60 minutes, and it involves building up a relationship, creating a safe space for the person to talk. I mean, that's another thing about our society in terms of cultural blocks. There's so few people, so few places where people can talk freely. Where can a person talk about being suicidal? You know, it's a no-no. And I find quite regularly, for example, that if somebody is feeling suicidal and for 20 or 30 minutes with me, they can talk it through and cry and grieve, that quite often at the end of 20, 30 minutes, they feel different and they're not quite so suicidal anymore. So I suppose I try to engage with where the person's at, get to know them, help them express themselves, and look at what's possible to move things forward. I always have a sense in the back of my mind of recovery. I consider it a realistic sense. You know, it's like a marathon. Recovery is at the end of the line, really, but there's a process. And you don't talk about recovery, or at least I don't talk about recovery. I talk about where the person's at and what the next few steps would be. But one of my fundamental beliefs is to see the rightness in the experience, and that is very illuminating for people, for them to get a sense that what they're feeling and what they're doing makes some sense. And William Glasser talked about, you know, cultivating self-responsibility. I think, you know, that's very important. I've noticed that very, very important. And when we get wounded in life, quite often we find it difficult to be responsible for ourselves, to take full ownership of ourselves. So that's often something that emerges in the work, but it has to be gradual and gentle. I know I'm going on a bit, but this is what I do.
No, I'm sitting here thanking God we have therapists like you in the world. Thank God, Terry.
I've
Um,
been I've been really passionate about seeking to understand. I mean, that to me, you asked me about what, that to me is key. Seeking to understand what it is the person's experiencing, how they got there, and then how they can get out.
so there's much more of a normalization of the experience as opposed to pathologizing the experience.
Yes. Oh,
And
total normalization. Yes.
right,
As in, now understanding it and explaining it doesn't necessarily justify it. There's a slight
mhm.
difference there, if you know what I'm saying.
I do.
Um,
I do, because you're not giving them a victim card where they can just
yes,
rest in the diagnosis and say,
that's right.
I can remember when I worked with foster children, I picked up a child, a runaway once that I didn't know, and
Yeah,
I asked her story, and she was telling me about how, she can't stay in a foster home for more than 2 months at a time. She's got to go. And I said, well, what's up with that? And her response to me was, well, it's my bipolar. As
yeah,
if that was the cause of everything, and that became the reason for every single thing she did, as opposed to just an understanding of what her particular experience was at that time, and
that is
and
right. Yes,
yeah, and the
absolutely. I think it's
responsibility
such an
piece
important
for
point.
your own recovery.
Yeah, and that I find myself doing that a lot. Even from what you said about that person. I mean, one of the things that fascinates me about this work is the recurring themes. Um, I I think the work I'm involved in is actually very scientific because it actually follows scientific principles far more than psychiatry does. Because it's quite predictable in lots of ways and quite repeatable, replicable. But if you take that person you mentioned, how does it help her to interpret or frame what she does as part of her bipolar? It doesn't empower her at all. It can become, I suppose, a excuse isn't quite the right word, but a reason to continue and not do a whole lot about it. But it doesn't help the person fundamentally. Whereas, even from that little bit you said there might be an issue about contact. I've regularly found in this work that contact is a big deal. It's a big issue. When we get wounded in life, which is a very, very common theme, we often find it very difficult to maintain contact. And often the person we find hardest to maintain contact with is ourselves. And in particular, making contact with our sadness, our hurts, our losses. And so a lot of what is considered to be mental health problems is actually people's attempts to distance themselves from themselves. And
Yes.
sometimes I think if people are really kind and loving to them, and they've experienced a lot of hurt and pain, it can, after a while, there's a risk that the block of ice that the defense mechanism they've had to put around their heart might be melted by this kindness, and they might actually come into their own emotions and their own pain. And many people in that situation are faced with a dilemma. Do I continue with this thawing out process and go through the pain, or will I just run away again? I'm not saying, obviously, I don't know if that was the case for that girl, but I've regularly found that
You hit
a
you
lot of
hit the
people are
nail right on
tempted
the
to,
head.
yeah, people are tempted to run through the pain. And again, that's a cultural block because there is no framing of pain as something you can work through really in society. It's reinterpreted and distorted into this concept of mental illness. I don't know if you know, I mean, when the DSM-5, you mentioned the DSM-5 earlier on, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is often referred to as the Psychiatrist's Bible, and the last one was, number 5, was published in 2013. Well, the director, the lead psychiatrist for the DSM-4, was asked by an British psychologist, James Davies. He was asked, if he could define mental disorder, the term mental disorder, and it was Alan Francis, who I'm sure you've heard of. His answer was, it's actually a word I can't really repeat. It begins with B. He said it's BS, basically. The concept is BS. You can't define it, basically. But that's not what the public hear, And so there's a huge distortion of experience. And I think if we're to make headway as a society, we have to come back to brass tacks, and we have to say to ourselves, maybe a person's fear makes sense. Maybe maybe their loss of self needs to be worked with. And let's work with what is there rather than what we want to be there, if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, I think as I would interpret that last statement, it's trying to fit people into this nice, neat box or category of how people should be, instead of allowing them to be who they really are.
Absolutely. I mean, how can somebody work through something if they're either not allowed to be or are terrified themselves of being where they are? I mean, by definition, they're pulling away from themselves into a stuck place.
Right, and if we have this very small experience of what the culture or society determines is normal, and I do that with my quotation marks, if a person doesn't fit into that little tiny category, then they're abnormal, and there's something they interpret, therefore there's something wrong with them. And yeah, I'm imagining that if you're on the out fringe, you're either gonna shun that version of normalness, or feel overwhelmed by what they'd have to do to fit in. So it becomes something that they just kind of give up on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely, you're so right. I mean, you use that word overwhelm. That is such a common theme in people who end up with a diagnosis, overwhelm. And again, you're so right. I mean, I regularly find in the work that people who have experienced wounding, considerable wounding in their life. Many years ago, I read a book by Virginia Satir called People Making. Great book. And she talked in the book about, she mentioned that by the time a child is 5, they've had about 1 billion interactions. Now, the exact figure doesn't matter, but it's an awful lot of interactions. So by the time a child is 10, they've had about 10 billion, roughly, give or take a few 100,000 interactions. That's an awful lot of interactions. And the child is there growing up trying to figure things out, what their value is, how to fit in, how to get their needs met. It's a very complicated process. And I think it's not too surprising in this rather challenging world that many children, teenagers, young adults of any age become overwhelmed. But there's no flow from that. The overwhelm gets distorted into illness. And so the overwhelm, what caused it, and how to help that person get back on track, isn't addressed generally at all, because the whole thing is distorted into a mental illness issue, which it isn't, and it gets stuck in that. And so frequently, a big part of the work I do with people is trying to help people get back on that motorway of life. And that's a real struggle for people. And there are very, very few pathways in our society for that. And to me, it's ridiculous, because it's so obvious.
Right.
But I think there are powers within our world who don't want that to happen, because they would lose out. And I think the public have to wise up a bit here, because a lot of the advice that's given by supposed experts, the public need to realize that a lot of experts have a vested interest in their own advice and in what they're advising.
Right, I know. I don't think this is true in Ireland, but I know in the US we have direct-to-consumer advertising for psychotropic medication. So you can be watching the evening news and you get the commercial for the newest medication that will take away your depression. And if that drug isn't enough, you might want to add this drug. And I don't know the statistics on it. You may, but I believe probably there's a very high percentage of the population who is on some kind of medication for an emotional issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know the exact figure in America, but I do know that I saw a figure in Ireland some time ago within the last 2 years to say that roughly 10% are in the region of about 150,000 people, I think, were on antidepressants. Now, it could be wrong with that figure, but I mean, doctors are saying that, I think it's more than that. Doctors will maintain that 10% of the population, 5 to 10% of the population at any given time, suffer from an illness called depression. And you're right, we don't have direct-to-consumer advertising here, but drug companies have lots of ways of getting through to people the message. And this is why I'm calling my next book Depression Delusion, because it's not the experiences that are delusion. The experiences are very real, and the behavior is very real, but the interpretation is delusional. And the commonest example of that, and I'm sure it's been used for years in those advertisements you mentioned in America, the commonest example of that is that your depression is caused by a chemical imbalance.
Right.
You know, that is, in my opinion, a very, very serious thing to do in society, to lie to people publicly like that, because there is no evidence. It's never been established that there was a chemical imbalance to begin with. It's the height of cheek, in my opinion, for organizations, powerful organizations, to mislead the public in this way. And I think the drug regulators and I think governments have some serious questions to answer in regard to how they have allowed this situation to evolve, where very powerful organizations have managed to persuade the public of untruths. If you stop, I imagine if I stopped 100 people on the street in New York and I asked them what causes depression, I would guesstimate that 70 to 75%, if not more, would say, oh, that's caused by serotonin deficiency, isn't it?
Yes.
You know, that is utter misinformation. That should not be happening. And it's outrageous, in my opinion, that this is what the public are being fed.
Well, there's the thought that there's some blood tests that measure serotonin levels, but from my understanding, that blood test isn't even directly measuring serotonin. Is that right?
Well, the way it works is this. I mean, I've talked about this in Beyond Prozac, and I talk about it in my next book too. You can judge people more by what they do than by what they say. If there was a blood test that could show serotonin levels, you can be sure it would be happening in every GP surgery or every family physician surgery, just like tests for diabetes is happening. So the fact that it never happens is a pretty important pointer to the fact that there are no tests that can be done to check for serotonin. You cannot actually measure brain serotonin levels at all. There is no test for brain serotonin levels. You can do a general blood level of serotonin, but it's a useless test by and large for anything other than very rare tumors which cause raised serotonin levels in the gut, basically in the gastrointestinal system, that have nothing to do with depression. So it's a real con job, this whole thing about chemical imbalances. And what it has allowed to happen is this framing of experience as illness. And it has to be addressed.
Yes, I'm hoping that this summit does a little bit of that. Yeah. And what would you say to our viewers who recognize that in life there's so many things that people have no control over, things that happen, you know, bad things happen to good people kind of thing. How do you think it's possible for people to maintain positive mental health in light of these events that happen to people over which they have no control?
That's a big question. There's a lot I could say, really. I find in the work I do, I try to look at how the person is approaching themselves and life. I try to suggest to people that, you know, if with regard to things you cannot control, that are outside your control, I try to suggest to people that to try to minimize the effect that has on them. You know, there are a lot of things going on in the world that are awful, that's true. And there's also a lot of things going on in the world that are very good, but we don't hear about those in the news. So one of the things I suggest to people is to try to separate out your own personal life somewhat from stuff that's happening miles away. Now, I'm only saying that in the sense because some people get overwhelmed by stuff coming in on top of them from the news, and then they end up disempowered and depressed, and then they're, you know, they're really, their whole ability to function is not helped. So, you know, what I often suggest to people is, again, we're back to a key concept here, which is acceptance. And it's a very hard concept sometimes. You know, the world is the way it is. There's great good in this world, and there's great bad too. And I think if we're to address what is wrong with the world, we must start by accepting it as it is, and then we work from there. And that's a much more empowered position. I often say, people who might be in the frame of mind you described, Kim, who come to me quite often, very understandably, all of this stuff to me, a key area in life is boundaries. And I work a lot with people on boundaries, their own personal boundary, their own personal space. How are they managing their boundary? How are they managing their personal space? I have a lot in selfhood about that. And I have found that helping people to be proactive about what they let into their space and how to deal with that can empower people to deal more effectively with the bad news and with the darker and nastier side of life. I do think that avoiding the reality of that side of life doesn't help us very much. So I'm not sure if that's answering your question, but there's a lot of little steps I would suggest along the way.
Well, I definitely.
Sorry, yeah?
I was just going to say I definitely like that answer, because I know when my son was serving as a soldier in Iraq, I made the very conscious decision to turn off my television because I didn't want to see the scrolling CNN headlines about what was happening over there. And I figured, if I needed to know something, I would eventually learn about it, but I didn't need to be on the edge of my seat fretting every minute of every day wondering if he was going to...
That's absolutely right, because you end up disempowered, enormously distressed, and what you're fearing may never have happened anyway. And yeah, I mean, another very important concept, and it's a well-known concept, is the whole concept of mindfulness. Mindfulness and living in the now. And a lot of us have drifted from that. Because again, it isn't seen as it is more recently seen as important, but the skill of living in the now is such a great quality for our mental health. And mindfulness often involves meditation, which is great, it's fine, it's very good, but to me mindfulness is a state of mind where one focuses one's attention on the here and now as much as possible. And I find that very helpful in the works. People will often come in overwhelmed by the bigger pictures of their life, the bigger pictures of their life and the bigger pictures of life out there. And what I often try to do is to break it down a little bit and see, rather than the huge picture, bring it down to the small stuff and to see what they could do to edge something forward right now. William Glasser, one of the things I loved about him, and I loved many things about him, but one of the things I loved was, I read many years ago, he said that there was kind of 4 things we could try to do when we feel bad. I can't quite remember what they all were. One of them was do something.
Mm-hmm.
He was maintaining that that's the quickest way to change how we feel, by actually doing something.
Yes.
And I think he's dead right. Now, the doing is not avoiding. That's important. It's not a doing that helps us avoid the situation. But it's like, so say a kid who's completely overwhelmed with homework he's got to do, and his reaction is to do none. Well, I will often in that situation say, okay, why don't you spend 15 minutes? 15 minutes first. Forget the big picture. Pick something. Write a paragraph. If you find a paragraph difficult, write 2 lines. Mm-hmm. Because in the doing of that, something changes inside the person. Now, when that is a huge issue for the person, obviously doing that once or twice isn't going to transform the person. But if the person can make that a habit, where they create little victories in the face of enormous battles, that's how we enhance our sense of self, I think. And that's how our confidence grows, by picking an area where we can actually do something. And initially we will react against it because we're so fearful. But if we just stick with it and get a little bit done, and then come away, and then go back again and do another little bit by bit, coming and going, that's something I regularly recommend to people. And I think avoidance, I think we have to be careful of avoidance. I think that it's a very understandable defense mechanism. But if avoidance becomes avoidance of what is there in front of us, and avoidance of what we need to address, if that becomes a way of life, what it tends to do is it mounts up all the problems for us. It diminishes our sense of self. It makes the world seem much bigger and us a lot smaller. So again, addressing step by step what is there, and seeing it as a medium-term project. Not a short-term fix, but a medium-term, like creating a new philosophy of living, gently, gradually. And what I regularly find when I work with people, and when they come towards, shall we say, the end of the work, I speak in Selfhood about what I call the peace dividend. Because when a person has truly reclaimed their sense of self and has worked through the pain, usually they experience great peace. And this comes back to the whole idea of happiness. I often think of happiness as, it's not, I don't know if it's a goal of itself. I see it more as a byproduct. Yes. As a byproduct of what we have done, how we have lived, the choices we have made, how we have managed to address things, and how we have managed to come to live in the world as it is, really. Does that make sense?
It does. And when I think about happiness, I also think about what you mentioned, and that's that peace, that yes. just a peace. It's not like the real high on the roller coaster. It's more just this really okayness with whatever's going on. I know that's not a word. I went to school a long time to be able to use that big word, okayness, but it's just that acceptance, really, of yes. what is. It's not that you're giddy, although giddy moments of giddiness are great, but it's really yes. that okayness with whatever's going on.
Yes, so, absolutely.
I'm wondering if you have any tips or strategies. I know you've been kind of sharing them as we go along, but I don't know if there's anything you would offer our viewers in terms of habits that they could cultivate that would help them maintain or improve their current state of mental health.
Right. Okay, I think one of the first ones is connect with where they are, and be mindful of language. I'm depressed, for example, would be a very commonly used phrase because that's culturally accepted now. And what I often suggest to people is try to go to more accurate words first, because usually it's I'm sad. Beneath the depression or that feeling of depression, there's often sadness. I'm stuck. I'm lost. I'm lonely. So articulation, expressing what it is they're feeling. Now, the most important person who needs to hear that is themselves.
Yes.
So, saying it to themselves, writing it, journaling every day, and in the journaling, honoring themselves, honoring how they are, honoring what they're feeling. If it's possible, if there are one or two people in their life that they can talk freely with, that's great. I think then looking at their life, and as I said earlier, trying to find one or two chinks that they can work with, doing one or two things that are a little bit different, and looking kind of honestly as well. Honesty to me is very important, honesty with ourselves, looking honestly at how I'm living, what I'm doing, and not at the gigantic changes that I might need to make, but the little changes, and how well am I taking care of myself, a key issue. When we get hurt and wounded, quite often we don't take care of ourselves. How am I relating? Am I relating as best I can, really? Am I listening well, but am I also expressing well? So I would be very much about practicalities, looking at one's life now and seeing what I can do now to make some changes. A very important concept is honoring oneself. If we're not honoring ourselves, we're generally dishonoring ourselves. And it's amazing how frequently we dishonor ourselves in everyday life and in everyday interactions. And I often suggest to people that they gently look at that. Gently. I'm a great believer in gentleness in this whole process. And there are times when we need to say no a little bit more, for ourselves, because it's a cliche, but it's true. If I'm always saying yes to other people, I am actually saying no to me. So I need to look at that sometimes. Now, the reverse is also true, because when we've been quite wounded, quite often one of our defense mechanisms is to say no all the time. But that too can be a problem if we're doing it all the time or most of the time. So maybe I could risk saying yes. Now, when I say yes sometimes and I'm not used to saying yes, one of the first things I'm going to feel is anxiety, because I'm stepping out of my comfort zone. That's another thing I work with on people, is the whole area of comfort zones. Because when we're wounded and we wounded a lot and we find life difficult, we retreat into a comfort zone. And the comfort zone is a comfort zone, but it's also a bit of a prison. So finding ways to step out of that comfort zone, little bits, and then back in again, and stepping out and stepping in, and realizing that actually we can survive outside our comfort zone. helps us to expand our comfort zone. So that's something at a relatively early stage in the work, I regularly work with on people. I could probably talk all day long about this, to be honest. There's so much in terms of what I could suggest.
Yes.
It's an intriguing area, really.
Well, you know, Terry, as you were talking, I thought about a particular group of people, and I suspect your advice would be no different for them, but maybe you could address it specifically. And I'm thinking of people in the helping professions like you and I. I think we have a lot of viewers who are in that situation, and I think there's maybe perhaps a myth that they can't, how could they show weakness, or how could they seek help when they themselves are the helper? What would people think of them if they think, oh, they have problems too, they have emotions too? So what might you say to viewers in that particular role as it relates to the things you just shared?
That's a very, very good question, very important issue. I'll tell you what I do. I mean, you see, again, some of this comes back to how we frame things. And how I frame things in general is, I'm a human being, and so is the person sitting opposite me. We share a common humanity. So I have no issue, actually, sharing my humanity with the person there. When it feels right, obviously. Because I'm okay with my humanity. I'm okay with the fact that I get scared and I get angry, and I don't feel the need to hide that. And I think that quite often people will often say to me, it was great that you shared that, because it made me feel, you know, you're human like me. So all I can say is what I've done, which is I've tried to discard, you know, I don't really see myself as a therapist. I see myself as a human being, primarily. And when I'm working with someone, I'm working with another human being. We're equals in this process, joining together. An accompanier. I'm an accompanier, really. And so I will share aspects of my life if I feel it's relevant or it's going to be in some way helpful to the person. Because I think it is a way of, again, normalizing experience. You know, so I'm not sure if that answers the question.
Yeah, it really does, and I think it's helpful because I know I've fallen prey to that myself. You know, when my husband passed away, and I'm caring for my two boys. They were 13 and 15, and I'm trying to be the rock. You know, I have to be the steady one and provide. And I know I went through that, and I hid a lot, and it was, you know, it wasn't a long time before I started to share more about what I was feeling, and even share with them. I think it was important for them to know that I was missing their dad too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, it's often said that, you know, people hear our words, but they also pay attention to our body language and our general mode of communication. And I think, absolutely, you know, if somebody really important to you dies, that's big. And I think if you talk to your children about that and get upset and cry, the message you're actually giving them is how much this person mattered.
Right.
And you're actually validating their life. And it also gives them the message, well, if mommy's crying or daddy's crying, it's okay for me to cry.
That's right.
I think that is so important, you know. So I think as a society we have to stop running from our humanity. I think we do run from our humanity, and I think we've caused, I mean, as a society, we've caused such problems. You know, and it starts, it's everywhere, and it's cultural hugely, you know, in schools and in sports clubs, and, you know, an awful lot of good happens in all those places, of course, but there's this subtle messages that children get, and then adults, you know, teenagers get and adults get, to suppress and to conform to a certain way of being. And then what does the person who experiences an awful lot of fear or anxiety do? How do they cope with the fact that, as you said earlier, they're experiencing a lot of things that society is telling them they must block? Yeah. You know, it isolates them enormously.
Yeah. So
forgive me if I've gone off track there.
You didn't. We're completely on track. What I want to remind our viewers is that if you have questions for Dr. Lynch, please email your questions to questions at mentalhealthandhappiness.com. And if you get them in the next few minutes, I'll be able to ask Dr. Lynch to answer your questions. And in the meantime, I'd like to know, Terry, how our listeners could purchase your books. Where are they available? How could they get them?
Sure. Well, they're certainly available on Amazon, Amazon.com, Amazon UK. Beyond Prozac the second edition was published in 2005. It's probably not in bookshops in America, but it's certainly available through the internet bookshops. And similarly, Selfhood. Selfhood is different to Beyond Prozac. Selfhood is really a workbook designed to help people work to reclaim their sense of self, whereas Beyond Prozac is more a consideration, I suppose, of what's wrong with the mental health services as they are. And in my work, I'd like to make this clear. I'm not completely anti-medication. To me, medication has a place. So, I'm not saying people, and by the way, nobody listening to this should, on the basis of anything I'm saying, stop their medication, because stopping medication causes problems, withdrawal problems. What I do like to try to do, though, is identify what those substances are actually doing. So, say I'm working, with someone with a diagnosis of depression or bipolar or schizophrenia. What I will try to help them do is to understand what they're going through, understand the ins and outs of it, try to understand mania more and hypomania from an emotional and psychological perspective, because it can be understood from that perspective, and to try to learn about the whole thing and try to find other ways to become empowered in addition to and sometimes instead of medication.
That's
a very gradual, gentle process.
Yes, thank you for that. If our viewers would like to connect with you, is there a way for them to do that?
Sure. My email address, I've just got a new website, actually. My partner and wife, Marianne, is a psychotherapist. We work together. Our website is called recoveryourmentalhealth.com. Now, it's really a brand new, recoveryourmentalhealth.com. It's a brand new website, so we don't have that much on it just yet. But my email address is info@recoveryourmentalhealth.com. But my intention, mental health is my world, really. It's my passion. I would be publishing a book about every year or every 15 months, and I know the ones I will publish already. And there are two core themes. One is to look at the current situation and what's wrong with it, and the second is to set out a richer understanding of the things we call mental illnesses and human distress in general.
Great. And would it be fair to say that your book on selfhood would help people improve their mental health and happiness if they follow the exercises?
Without question. It's a book that is filled with what people have told me is they've learned a great deal about themselves in it, and there are a lot of exercises and a lot of steps to help people progress. And the reason I wrote that when I did write it was that it was such a recurring theme in everybody who walked in my door. Their sense of self was reduced. Now, as I thought about this, I began to realize that that's actually a defense mechanism. That when we are quite wounded in the world, having a strong sense of self becomes too risky. So we actually reduce our sense of self as a defense mechanism. So increasing our sense of self can be a scary prospect. And on the one hand, it's a lovely, lovely prospect. But on the other hand, it's quite scary. Because if I'm wounded and I feel the need to defend myself from lots of situations that might hurt me, having a strong sense of self might mean I end up doing these things that scare me so much. So for many people, it's quite a terrifying, although attractive prospect. So it's kind of walking that tightrope between addressing the fear respectfully, but progressing one's sense of self, and in that process, reclaiming one's life, really, because what I talk about in selfhood is things like self-expression, self-reliance, what I call self-generated security. When we lose our sense of self and quite wounded, we don't feel safe, and that is a recurring theme in people who attend therapists, doctors, not feeling safe. And the term self-generated security to me is very important, and self-empowerment. So many selves, really, all of which contribute to a strong sense of self.
Great. Dr. Lynch, I want to thank you so much. This is just incredible to me that you're in Ireland, I'm in Chicago, and we have people around the globe watching this. It's just the technology is phenomenal, and it's so exciting. I want to thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you for being with us. And coming up next, we have an interview with Robert Whitaker, the author of Mad in America. This one had to be pre-recorded because he wasn't available to us on this particular day. So if you're listening to this interview and would like to switch over to Robert Whitaker's interview, you need to check your email, because an email has been sent to you with the link to that recording. And when you're finished, come back to this page and we'll have the next interview after that. So thank you very much, and I look forward to talking with you again, Terry. Thanks so much.
And I do too. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Thanks.